I'm delighted to introduce journalist and entrepreneur Maria Ressa. As one of Asia's most well-known media figures, Maria focused on investigating terrorism in Southeast Asia for much of her 35-year career, opening CNN's Manila and Jakarta bureaus in the 80s and 90s. In 2012, she launched media and news website Rappler, where she remains as executive editor and CEO. Known for her uncompromising stance on press freedom, as well as her courage and grace under fire, Maria won Time Magazine's 2018 Person of the Year for tackling fake news across the world. Speaking candidly for a moment, as a journalist, she is one of my idols, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation this morning on overcoming adversity and the values that will see you through the toughest of tough times, which we're very much living through right now, Maria. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Lee. Well,
it's such a pleasure. I'm going to get straight into it because we have so many questions and so much to talk about. Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill you can only make you stronger. And boy, we've been going through a lot recently. After all these years facing adversity, is that still something you subscribe to?
Yeah, absolutely. From going to the gym to dealing with press freedom issues to setting up a business. Really, it's a great quote. And, you know, you always have, when you run into problems, you have to tackle that problem in a way that is always constructive. Right? And that idea, you know, I talk about this all the time. It's like going to the gym. You break some muscles, you break tissue and ligaments, and then you create something stronger on top of it. It's how you deal with adversity. That's our topic, right? So the best way to deal with adversity is to welcome it, because without it, you can't grow.
Right. But you also need a roadmap to kind of see you through those tough times, right? And I think, you know, for you, you've said when we've spoken in the past, that's really your values. So what are those values that see you through those difficult times? And has there ever been a time where you've questioned them and wanted to say, oh, you know, forget it?
So, you know, one of the interesting things when we chatted is realizing that there's a whole group of people listening to us now. And thanks, guys, for spending your time with us. So I think you have to start. It's very easy to say, I live by my values. And, you know, I am late 50s. So I do know my values, but how do you get there, right? So I think you start with first knowing why, asking why. Why do you do what you do? And then slowly you will begin to build these values. And then when they're tested, your identity is defined by how you protect your values, right? What compromises do you make? Are these values, do you have situational ethics, or are you going to take the risk? Are you going to stand up against whatever the attack or the threat or the challenge? I think that's really critically important. And if you're running a business today, that's also a critical question to ask, because it's always a battle. It's interesting listening to Matthew. You know, it's always a battle between making money and standing by your values, right? So that's, I think, one of the nice things about being a journalist. And this is really how my values were formed. This is my, gosh, I became a reporter in 1986. You know, so I've been a journalist my entire life. I helped write standards and ethics manuals through the worst of times and the best of times in CNN, in ABS-CBN, which is a network I led in the Philippines for 6 years, and then in Rappler. So you know who you are. And I think what solidifies who you are is how much you will fight to maintain those values around you.
Yeah. You mentioned situational ethics there. Can we go on that for a moment there? I think it's pretty obvious in the name what they are, but can we talk a little bit about that? What are situational ethics?
When your ethics change depending on the situation, right? And oftentimes, and this is a question that we have all the time in the battle with technology, for example, journalists, news groups used to be the gatekeepers to the public sphere. Our standards and ethics manual actually are built around protecting the public sphere, protect the public sphere instead of making money, for example. What happens when our gatekeeping powers are handed to tech people who abdicate responsibility, who have atomized meaning to a point that it is meaningless, and have allowed lies laced with anger and hate to spread faster than facts in the public sphere? So I think for me, the question there is, you know, so what are the incentives for the tech companies? Well, if the end goal is only to make money, then our public sphere will remain polluted and we won't be able to tell the difference between fact and fiction.
Right. You've said in the past that the Philippines is a petri dish of fake news, is because Filipinos spend more time on the internet than any other country, and 97% of that is on social media, right? It is on Facebook. And I think, with ABS-CBN having its license revoked recently, broadcast media has lost even more of a significant voice in people's media diets, meaning even more people are going to flock to social media for their news. So, you mentioned journalists' role as the gatekeeper. We have lost that role as the gatekeepers of truth. Will we ever get it back? And what should big tech be doing to fix this and to kind of meet their new responsibilities?
So, wow, so many huge questions in one, but like the first one, I count three there, right? The first one is, it's actually 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. So Facebook is our internet. The second one was about ABS-CBN, and now that it's been shut down, the first time since 1972, right? So the first time ABS-CBN was shut down in the 70s, it was followed by 21 years of a dictatorship and then lifted by the 1986 People Power Revolt. That moment began the movement to freedom in Southeast Asia, right? Movement from one-man authoritarian rule to democracy. And then the third part of, as they move to social media, does that mean more people are going to be on social media? Actually, it's more that Filipinos are already on social media, and more will flock to ABS-CBN. Of course, they're huge. They have the stars, right? But I think two things. Number one, let's not forget the deep cut to press freedom when you shut down the largest broadcaster. It's like if you're in Great Britain and they shut down BBC, right? Or if you're in the United States and they shut down CBS. The second one is in terms of tech, right? I thought before the pandemic that the key question of 2020 was going to be the role of technology in the public sphere, the movement towards regulation, because even Mark Zuckerberg is saying we need regulation, right? Facebook needs regulation. But I think the problem now has been compounded, and hopefully I think a path forward has been put in place by dealing with the coronavirus. And I say that because the social media platforms are doing things, taking down content that they never used to do before that, right? They would do takedowns of networks, but for the first time, you have someone like the leader of a country, Bolsonaro from Brazil, having his posts and his tweets taken down, Rudy Giuliani being taken down, right? Because in this day and age, lies kill, right? So what we need to do moving forward, and what I hope these social media platforms will do, is to take these same principles and move it towards the sphere when frontliners like journalists, human rights activists, truth tellers, when people are under attack by political disinformation.
And, you've talked about social media as a behavior modification system, which it absolutely is. I mean, it collects data and it knows you better than you know yourself sometimes. And then it takes that data, some of your most obvious vulnerabilities, and sells it to the highest bidder. Yet, are you still surprised in everything that all the research that you've done? Are you still surprised that most of us are pretty blasé about that?
Absolutely. A great book for everyone here, although it's very long, but you can read an abridged summary, Surveillance Capitalism by Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff. Surveillance capitalism. We know this in a lot of different ways. I just spoke a few weeks ago with Edward Snowden, and he just pointed out that, what he was a whistleblower for, the massive surveillance that governments were doing, coupled with now the surveillance powers of private companies are now ruling our world, right? The artificial intelligence, machine learning, the data we put in, pulled together by machine learning, pulled together by artificial intelligence, actually know us far more intimately than our most intimate relations. And as you said, they're sold to the highest bidder. The problem is that even as this has happened, we've acted like the world is still the same. Right? We've acted like this is just the form of how we get news distributed or how we get information. That's far from it. And I always say you have to think about this time period like the world needs to come together like it did after Hiroshima,
Right.
after World War II, after Germany. And when we realize that we have to protect humanity against the worst of humanity, then you come together and you define values, right? What happened after World War II? Bretton Woods, NATO, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The Philippines was one of the first signatories. I think this is one of those times, and this is one of the times when the world needs to come together and say, hey, tech, what are your values? I noticed in the chain, someone was saying they're using artificial intelligence. When you're building something, when you're coding something, should you have values? And then I'll bring it to something you mentioned. I said that the Philippines is a petri dish. I did say it, but then someone much better than I said this to me in an interview, which is the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Christopher Wiley. Cornered him, asked him about the Philippines, Southeast Asia, the role of emerging countries like us, Nigeria, which has been exposed. He called us a petri dish because he said that Cambridge Analytica was testing tactics of mass manipulation in our country, and if it worked, they ported it to the West. So it wasn't a surprise that the country with the most number of compromised accounts in the Cambridge Analytica scandal is the United States, the target, right? But the country with the second most number of compromised accounts was the Philippines.
Yeah, yeah, that was you guys indeed. You mentioned Edward Snowden there, which clang, that's an impressive name drop there, Maria. And I know you have so many of them. You know, from the 80s to the 2000s, you interviewed pretty much every world leader. I'm curious to know if there's one thing in particular you learned from them, or you still learn from them, or if there's one attribute that you noticed was common to all the impressive world leaders that you met.
Being a reporter is an amazing job because you get to ask questions, and if you try to be a sponge and learn, then it's amazing, right? So for me, I loved looking at leaders. What made leaders work? And you know, what I always came out of it with is that your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. So when you become a leader, you need to protect against your greatest strength, which is your greatest weakness. I think in general, every company, every club, let's start with a club, a company, a country, always reflected the leader's weaknesses. And if the leader is very good, they have put in place a group of people who will protect the organization from the leader's weaknesses.
Indeed. Indeed. And I also want to kind of segue a little bit into your role as an entrepreneur as well, because you're not just a media leader, you're a business leader as well. I mean, you know, in 2012, you went from running newsrooms your entire career, which are these notorious, you know, cost centers for a business, to running a business of your own where you need to kind of watch out for the bottom line. How did you find that transition to an entrepreneur? And what were some of the key things that you learned?
I wouldn't have been able to do it if I hadn't run ABS-CBN. That newsroom was about 1,000 people. And at that point, we were making more than 2 billion pesos a year, and we were spending most of it, right? Starting Rappler was a huge challenge in the sense that we knew what our mission was. We knew all the values, kind of like what Matthew was saying. We knew what we wanted to do, but we needed to prove that journalists can actually run a business, because journalists are the worst business people, right? And I really learned that because, you know, like in a gathering of CEOs, I'd rather interview the CEOs than cut deals with the CEOs, right? So what did I learn? I learned that it all starts with your diversification of revenues. Whatever that thing is that you are doing, you need to look for the worst case scenario always, and prepare for that. And I'll tell you, that's the reason why we're in a good place during a pandemic, because the last 4 years we've been under attack by our government. I don't know if you guys all know, right? Like our attack online, exponential attacks, extreme violence online began in 2016. In 2017, those same attacks were repeated by my President Duterte himself, and not just to anyone. He did it in his State of the Nation address. And then a week later, I had my first subpoena. And in 2018, the government filed 11 cases and investigations against us. And then in 2019, I was arrested twice and detained, and then I had to post bail 8 times in order to stay free.
And
I
what's
paid.
remarkable is that despite it all, in 2019, you still made a profit.
We
I
did.
want to know how, as somebody who strives to be in your chair one day and run a media company, how do you make a media company profitable in such a short space of time, despite all of the challenges you faced?
Nietzsche said it, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Mm.
All of these cases that the government filed against us in 2018, when we moved to the court trials in 2019, our advertising dropped. So by April of 2018, 50% of our advertising dropped.
Mm.
And what do you do when that happens, right? Because obviously this is a war of attrition. That was what the government wanted. But what we did is we looked at everything that we were doing and we began a B2B model using technology and data. Yeah. And that part of our diversification of the revenue stream grew 1,200%, right, in the last part. And that has prepared us. Look, every news group now wants to move away from advertising. We're only 23% dependent on advertising. That's fantastic. We're ready for the future. We're ready for a pandemic. I hate to say that.
Right. You know, nobody wishes it on anyone, but it's good to hear that you're robust enough to weather the storm, absolutely, and continue to do the vital work that Rappler does. I mean, you must be an absolute pro at crisis management by now. To put it mildly, what strategies or coping mechanisms even do you rely on in times of crisis?
Let me talk maybe about just 3 points, right? The first one is just you always have to make sure you understand what the problem is. What is the crisis? What do they want? And you have to strip away any sentimentality, any emotion. You have to look at it very clearly. So I always say, make the choice to learn, to understand. And then the second one is you have to embrace your fear. And you have to embrace your fear because that fear can be used against you. Remember, it's the leader's strength and weakness. If the leader is afraid, the organization is afraid. So you have to and I learned this when I was in kindergarten, when I was facing a bully. Embrace your fear. Whatever you're most afraid of, touch it, hold it, and then take away the sting of that fear. I think the third one is you have to beware of the pack, right? In a crisis, and I take this from coverage in war zones, and I'll bring up East Timor because this is where the lesson really sank in. It was in Timor, in Kashmir, in East Timor during the time, this would have been 1999, how long ago that was, right? But I was leading the CNN team, and every journalist, the news groups that were there, many of them flocked to the same hotel, which was the Turismo, because it was really nice. It was overlooking the ocean. But then what we did in Rappler is we went and rented a house in the government area, and we rented it early on and outfitted it the way we wanted to, because we just assumed we would have to spend a lot of time there. We stayed away from the pack. And when the violence erupted in East Timor, almost all the news groups, nearly all of them, evacuated at the same time. Rappler stayed till the last moment, right, when we could, and we had to then charter our own plane to take us out. But we could do that because here's the clincher: fear spreads. So all the journalists in that one hotel, when the shooting really began, fear spreads and you evacuate. So you never want to play with your life, but you also want to be very aware of your strengths and weaknesses here. So, and this is, your emotions versus your intellect.
Right, indeed. I think valuable advice for us all. I know we're getting so many questions in the chat box, and I have so many from the registrants as well to get to, but I'm going to ask you one final question of my own as a kind of way to close. So your optimism and cheerful disposition are remarkable, quite frankly, given the kind of stuff that you do go through. But these are dark times for us all at the moment in the midst of this pandemic. I'm wondering if you have a closing thought to leave the audience with that can maybe give some optimism to us all in this darkest of times.
I think we have to embrace that the world as we knew it will never be the same. We are at the end of week 9 of a lockdown in Manila, in the Philippines, which has largely been led by security forces, right? Uh, the three things that will be tested here, for all of our countries, the public healthcare system, the quality of crisis leadership, and then the third one is really our ability to trust each other, institutions. um, the destruction has happened. What are we going to create? And we are collectively creating this, right? We're doing this together. And I think if you come in without trusting your fellow man or woman, without trust, then we will leave behind the best of what humanity is. And we need to get there. Aside from, journalists are not the best at saying this because we hold power to account and we always are trying to demand accountability. But in the end, I also look for the goodness in human nature. And I think this is one of those times as we build a new world together.
Yeah, indeed. Well said. So we're going to move to some questions from our audience now. Before we do, we're going to launch a poll to get our audience's take on that very topic of optimism. We're going to ask our attendees, are you optimistic for the future? I'll ask you a question and then we'll see what we say and we'll come back to it. I hope that it will be positive reading, but I guess we'll see. So I have a question from Kenneth Hung, who left a question when he registered. He's an associate at Klook, the travel startup in Hong Kong. He asks, is there an affirmation or a message that you tell yourself every day?
This is funny. It's like when I was a kid, I read this book about Pollyanna, which is crazy, right? Two things that Pollyanna and Star Trek are the two things that I always remember, and I take it as you grow up. Pollyanna was like, you look for the good. And again, you can choose to be a glass half empty or half full person. I'm a glass half full person, and I choose that every day.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely the way that you need to live your life, particularly when you're in the chair that you're currently sat in, that very famous chair of yours, which I've seen in so many photographs and video conferences as well. So I'm going to move, let's have a look at what the result of the poll was as well. Oh, okay, Maria, I don't know if it was your inspirational words or if we just have a particularly optimistic group watching this morning, but it's pretty euphoric. 92% of people are, in fact, optimistic for the future.
I think it's the people you brought in, right? Because if you are an entrepreneur, you're not going to be pessimistic. Otherwise, why bother? Right? You have to be, yeah.
Indeed, we are a solutions-oriented platform, and I think a lot of our audience and community are a part of that as well. I want to ask you a question from the chat box as well. Isabel Francisco asks, what is the most memorable story you've covered or a person you've interviewed and why? So maybe something that's really impacted or affected you, someone that you've interviewed or a story that you've covered.
Gosh, there have been so many. And I can almost group them like 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. But I will say what I remember was Lee Kuan Yew, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. This one was, I'll tell you the story about Bill Clinton in like post-height of the Monica Lewinsky. And I asked him how he dealt, well, the first question I asked him was about East Timor, right? This was for the cameras of CNN. And I asked him, weren't you very late? Because, a lot of thousands died in East Timor. In the church in Suwai, there were 1,400 people, I think, is if I remember this correctly. But Bill Clinton, without blinking an eye, and he was coming in for the kind of birthing of East Timor, I interviewed him, and he said, he just admitted it. He said yes. And that took me by surprise, right? So accountability is really important. Lee Kuan Yew, I enjoyed all of his interviews because talk about somebody with a vision and someone who has taken kind of like he's accountable for what he's saying. At the same time, he delivered. One of the things I asked him about was corruption, because corruption is such an endemic problem in many of the countries I covered. And, he talked about when he took over and he cried and he wasn't sure about what's next. When he said that he needed to cut down corruption in Singapore, he said he knew he needed to to deal with his friends. And the first people whom he held accountable were his friends. I love things like that. There's so many interviews through the years, and I hope every single time I take something out of it.
Brutal honesty, and also brutal honesty with yourself, being able to shine light on yourself and admit, yeah, I was wrong. That's one of the things for any of us to do, right? No matter what seat of power we sit in, just sit there and say, I was wrong. There have been times when you've had to do that?
I'm knocking on wood. I was wrong. Not so much. Well, it's not that I haven't been wrong. Oh my gosh, most recently, just this weekend, I think there have been small mistakes along the way. I'll give you a funny one. In 1998, the economic crisis in Indonesia. I was in Indonesia and I was doing a live shot, and I hadn't slept in like 2 days, and it was for Lou Dobbs. And thank God this was during the time when there were still not recordings, but during the live shot, I just like completely blanked out. And Lou kept asking a question and I just didn't know what to say. So I was so tired, I ducked below the screen. I just ducked. That's a mistake. I mean, there's so many. Just this weekend, I made last Thursday, I made a slip of the tongue error. But I mean, in terms of huge mistakes, things that I would go back to change, I can't say that I would. Almost every single path. And I think that's what you can do moving forward. Take it from someone who's old. Is if you know your whys and you make your call every single time, you won't have any regrets in life. And I've kind of lived my life like that. I do not want to have any regrets. And part of the reason we're standing up for the rights in our Constitution, Rappler is an incredible organization of like-minded people. And part of the reason we're doing what we're doing is because we, in our heads, have already said, a decade from now, we don't want to look back and say we could have done something more. So whatever that is that when you're at a juncture point, make the call, but look back. Like, think of yourself a decade forward, and then try to look back and make the right call.
Right. Well, I don't have a good follow-up to that one, so I'm just going to duck.
That's exactly what I did. Thank God.
Drop and roll. I can jump to the side out. There's a number of different exit points I've got right now. Here and here. Just kidding. We have so many questions in the chat room as well right now. One of them from Renard Su. He's a Gen.T honoree from Malaysia. In fact, hi, Renard. Great to see you watching this morning. He asked, what's your number one fear?
Well, just right now, jail, right? Amal Clooney is one of my lawyers. She's leading our international team. And every time she emails me, they find some new, something they neglected. And she tells me, like my Christmas Eve email from her was, oh, Maria, it wasn't 63 years in prison, max of all the cases you're facing. It's actually 83 years. And then just recently, it's now 103 years, right? So I guess, and it took me like maybe 2 months to be okay with this possibility. Because if I wasn't okay with this, then I wouldn't be here, right? I wouldn't be running Rappler.
Absolutely, of course. There's a couple of questions I want to ask you about journalism in general, in fact, that came from our audience. One of them, with COVID-19 dominating the news, how do we ensure that less acute but equally significant issues still get the coverage that they deserve? There's a question from Janice Lung, who's a founder of Honest Green in Hong Kong.
Janice, it's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is that it won't, right? That's part of the reason. I think this is also a time for civic engagement. I think we need to push to keep shining the light on issues that need to be there. For example, climate change, right? Climate change is connected to viruses that will grow as the world gets hotter. The reality is that every news group in every country around the world will have finite resources. And as journalists are trying to redefine what journalism is going to be under lockdown, and we do this every day, right? When you only have government figures, what are you going to do? We began looking for leading indicators, but we have finite resources. Where do we deploy them? And that is based on the editorial agenda of
Yeah.
every single news group around the world. I
Right.
think if you care deeply about something right now, organize a community around it. Social media is there, but more than that, work with the journalists. We work very actively with our community in the Philippines and around the world. Let us know. And what we'll try to do is to use technology. This is where tech guys can also come in, to use technology to be able to expand the limits of the resources we have.
Right, indeed. We have another question on your role as a journalist from the chat box. This one's from Christine Chan. She asks, is there a must-ask question that you always ask when interviewing significant people or world leaders? Is there one question you always ask in most interviews?
Inevitably, I focus on broad questions that tell me why, right? I'm not really interested in the what, because I can get that from other sources. But I want to understand what drives the leader, why they do what they do, what are their values. Because
Mm,
once you get to that, then you have an idea of where their decisions will lead. You're looking for a leading indicator.
indeed. Well, you know what, then I'm going to cheat as a journalist and ask you that very question that you've just given me. And I'm going to say, what drives you? Why do you do what you do? And that seems like a great place to finish up.
I think justice, right? I mean, I grew into who I am because of the profession I chose. I was, like many Asian Americans, I'm a good student. I worked really hard. I read a lot. I actually was very quiet. I'm an introvert. And the job made me more than I am. And
Yeah.
I guess, I'll echo what Matthew said, meaning and purpose. Once I realized that the mission of journalism was about holding power to account, what's the purpose of that? It's about righting injustices around the world. It's about making sure that our societies grow, that we get better at it, right? So, yeah,
Mm.
trying to always realign, given the new world we live in. Every decade, it's something different. But realigning mission and purpose.
Mm. Maria, thank you so much for your candor, for your relentlessness, and for the honest answers that you gave us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again. I hope it's not too long until we speak again in the future. And I wish you all the best on all the fights, all the fronts that you are fighting with Rappler.
Thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you,
so much
Maria.
to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.